In the summer of 1812, a young Swiss adventurer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt made his way through the deserts of what is now Jordan, disguised as an Arab traveler and going by the name Sheikh Ibrahim, having spent years mastering Arabic and studying Islamic custom so thoroughly that he could pass, at least to a casual glance, as a native of the region. And it was on this journey, while pretending to fulfill a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of the biblical figure Aaron, that local guides mentioned an extraordinary set of ruins hidden in a narrow valley they called the Valley of Moses. And so, wary that too much curiosity would expose him as a European spy and cost him his life, Burckhardt talked his way past his own nervousness and followed his guide down through a shadowy, twisting crack in a wall of rose-colored rock, a passage so narrow in places that the sky nearly vanished overhead. Until after half an hour of walking through that eerie stone corridor, the passage opened suddenly onto an enormous facade carved directly into the cliff face, a soaring structure of columns and pediments so perfectly preserved that it looked, in his own words, as though it had been finished only yesterday. And in that moment, this quietly obsessive young explorer became the first person from Western Europe in centuries to lay eyes on the lost city of Petra, a place that had haunted rumors and legends for over 1,000 years, but which had, in truth, once been the beating commercial heart of one of the ancient world's strangest and most successful civilizations, a people known as the Nabataeans. And to understand how a nation could build such a spectacular home out of solid rock in one of the most punishing landscapes on Earth, and then vanish so completely that Europeans forgot it had ever existed, we have to go back long before Burckhardt, long before Rome, and even long before the sandstone itself took its famous rosy hue, because the story of Petra begins not with people at all, but with geology, since the red and orange stone that makes the city so famous is a sandstone formed from grains of sand compressed over unimaginable spans of time, laid down in shallow seas that once covered this part of the world more than 500 million years ago, back when the only living things on the planet's surface were simple mosses and lichens, and life in the oceans was dominated by early crustaceans and trilobites crawling through warm, shallow water. And as those ancient seas rose and fell across countless millennia, they deposited an enormous bed of sand that eventually hardened into rock, layered beneath by an even older band of stone rich in iron and manganese, which is what gives Petra's cliffs their famous swirling bands of red, purple, and gold, colors created by mineral staining rather than paint or dye. And this deep red rock would have stayed buried under younger, paler limestone forever were it not for the restless motion of the Earth's crust, because the Arabian tectonic plate has spent millions of years being slowly crushed and pushed northward by the neighboring African and Eurasian plates, a process so gradual it moves at roughly the speed fingernails grow, yet powerful enough over time to buckle mountain ranges and tilt entire regions of land. And it was this tilting that eventually exposed the ancient red sandstone in a handful of places across modern Jordan, including the site that would one day become Petra. And it's worth remembering that the ground beneath this city had already drawn human settlers for thousands of years before the Nabataeans ever arrived, in part because of a natural spring that still flows there today, a spring tradition long associated with the biblical story of Moses striking a rock to bring forth water in the wilderness. And this spring existed because the porous sandstone of the region behaves almost like a natural reservoir, slowly absorbing rain and releasing it gradually through the dry season, meaning the rock itself acts as a kind of hidden water tower in an otherwise merciless desert. And it was precisely this reliable trickle of water, combined with a naturally defensible position surrounded by towering cliffs, that eventually drew a nomadic desert people to make this valley their permanent home. And those people, the Nabataeans, first surface in written history not through their own words but through the writings of others, because we find hints of a group called the Nabataeans in Assyrian royal inscriptions from the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Texts in which kings like Sennacherib and his grandson Ashurbanipal describes subduing or clashing with a defiant desert tribe living in a barren land where, as one inscription poetically puts it, not even birds build nests. And while many modern historians are cautious about drawing a direct line between this early group and the later Nabataean kingdom, what is clear is that for centuries this region was home to nomadic herders who lived a mobile existence, moving with flocks of goats, sheep, and cattle, pitching tents rather than building permanent houses, foraging and hunting to supplement their diet, and occasionally returning to seasonal orchards planted along their migratory routes. And according to later Greek writers like Strabo, some of these early desert peoples also supplemented their income through opportunistic piracy along the Red Sea coast, ambushing merchant vessels before eventually being driven off by a punitive naval expedition. And it seems that somewhere in this transition from raiding to legitimate commerce lies the true origin of Nabataean wealth, because at some point these desert clans realized it was far more profitable and far less risky to charge merchant caravans a fee for safe passage through their territory than to rob them outright. And from offering protection, it was only a small step to organizing and operating the caravans themselves. And by doing so, the Nabataeans positioned themselves at the center of one of the ancient world's most lucrative trades, the transport of aromatic resins known as frankincense and myrrh, harvested from scrubby, gnarled trees native to southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, resins that oozed out when the bark was deliberately cut, and which then hardened in the sun into small fragrant chunks that were burned across the ancient world for their scent and their supposed medicinal and spiritual properties. And it's genuinely difficult for a modern audience to appreciate just how enormously valuable these substances were in antiquity. But incense was not merely a luxury indulgence. It was central to religious ritual from Mesopotamia to Egypt to the Hebrew temple tradition to the temples of Greece and Rome, used to mask the often overwhelming stench of pre-modern cities, believed to ward off the evil spirits many ancient peoples associated with the foul smells of sickness and decay, and considered so sacred in some traditions that its recipe and use were tightly restricted. And this demand only grew as empires expanded and their temple networks multiplied, meaning that by the time the Nabataeans rose to prominence in the final centuries BC, they were sitting on what amounted to a monopoly over one of the most sought-after commodities in the known world, controlling not just the frankincense and myrrh of Arabia, but also acting as middlemen for silks arriving from China, spices from India, ivory and exotic goods from East Africa, and metals and manufactured goods moving in the other direction from the Mediterranean world, all of it funneling through a web of desert trade routes that met at a single, spectacular crossroads carved into the cliffs of a hidden valley the Nabataeans called Rakhmu, but which the wider world would come to know by its Greek name, Petra, meaning simply rock. And this city did not stay a modest desert trading post for long. Because as Nabataean wealth grew, so did their engineering ambitions, and nowhere is this more apparent than in their extraordinary mastery of water, since the natural spring alone could never have supported a booming trade capital. So the Nabataeans built an elaborate network of channels, aqueducts, and terracotta pipes to funnel water from multiple springs directly into the city, while also developing techniques to plaster over natural rock basins, so they would hold rainwater rather than let it seep away through the porous stone. And they constructed dams to catch seasonal flash floods, converting a landscape prone to violent, destructive flooding into a reliable annual water supply. And they even devised a clever agricultural trick for growing fruit trees in the surrounding hills, digging enormous funnel-shaped depressions in the earth that would channel every drop of rain toward a single tree at the center, a technique that required roughly 50 times the normal amount of land per tree, but which was entirely practical in a place where space was the one resource in near-infinite supply. And this hydraulic engineering was not simply about comfort. It was also a matter of national security, because Greek historians recorded that the Nabataeans built secret underground cisterns scattered across the desert, sealed with narrow openings disguised to look like ordinary ground, known only to their own people. meaning that in wartime the Nabataeans could vanish into a landscape that looked to any invader like an empty, waterless wasteland, while quietly sustaining themselves from hidden reserves that no outsider could locate. And this strategy would prove decisively effective when the fractured remains of Alexander the Great's empire came looking for easy plunder. Because in 312 BC, one of Alexander's former generals, a one-eyed warlord named Antigonus who was determined to reunite Alexander's conquests under his own rule, dispatched a commander named Athenaeus with a force of several thousand soldiers to raid the wealth of Petra. And this raid initially succeeded beyond expectation, catching the city almost undefended while its men were away on business, allowing the Greek force to seize a staggering haul of silver along with captives and stores of frankincense and myrrh. But their triumph was short-lived, because Nabataean men returning from their travels quickly organized a retaliatory force of thousands of camel riders who covered ground far faster than the enemy's horses, tracking down the Greek camp under cover of darkness and annihilating nearly the entire raiding party in a single devastating night attack. And although the Nabataeans sent a conciliatory message afterward insisting they had only acted in self-defense, Antigonus, humiliated and unconvinced, soon sent his own son Demetrius with an even larger force to finish the job properly, only for this second invasion to founder against the same strategic advantages. Because the Nabataean population simply retreated to a fortified highland stronghold with their livestock and treasure, leaving the Greek army stranded in a landscape with no accessible water and no way to force a prolonged siege, until eventually the invaders were persuaded, through a mixture of stubborn resistance and a generous cash payment, to withdraw empty-handed. And this pattern would repeat itself again and again throughout Nabataean history, a people who avoided open warfare whenever possible, relying instead on their unmatched knowledge of the desert, their control of scarce water, and their sheer accumulated wealth to buy off or outlast anyone who threatened them. And it is one of history's great ironies that we know so much about this clever, cautious, remarkably successful civilization almost entirely through the writings of outsiders, because despite clear evidence of widespread literacy among the Nabataeans themselves, including casual graffiti left by ordinary shepherds, no surviving historical narrative written by a Nabataean author has ever been found, leading some historians to speculate that Nabataean society relied heavily on oral historians and professional storytellers, who preserved the nation's history through memory and recitation rather than through written record, a tradition that, if true, would have died with the last of those storytellers, leaving modern scholars to reconstruct Nabataean history in fragments pieced together from Greek geographers, Roman administrators, Egyptian bureaucratic papers, and the biblical and Jewish historical tradition. And these fragments occasionally offer strange, vivid glimpses into Nabataean life, such as a 3rd century BC Egyptian administrative document describing an encounter in which Nabataeans detained and punished 2 Greek chariot drivers for their mistreatment of a captive woman. A small but suggestive detail hinting that Nabataean culture held certain standards regarding the treatment of women, a picture reinforced by the appearance of Nabataean queens alongside kings on royal coinage, and by tomb inscriptions naming women as heads of households, or the account from the Jewish historian Josephus describing a friendly encounter between Nabataean travelers and the Jewish rebel leader Judas Maccabeus during his revolt against Seleucid rule, suggesting a degree of sympathy between two peoples who both prized their independence from larger imperial powers. And by the 2nd century BC, inscriptions begin naming actual Nabataean kings, confirming that what had once been a loose confederation of nomadic desert clans had, by this point, matured into a genuine centralized kingdom with a royal court, a functioning bureaucracy, and enough international standing that a Greek diplomat could mention an embassy to Petra in the same breath as an embassy to the great Egyptian metropolis of Alexandria. And it was during this era of growing wealth and confidence, sometime around the 1st century BC, that Nabataean stonemasons undertook their most spectacular architectural achievement, an enormous tomb facade carved directly into the cliff face at the end of the narrow entrance canyon, a structure today known as the Kosne, or the Treasury, believed by most scholars to have served as the burial monument of a Nabataean king, blending Nabataean religious symbolism with the columns, pediments, and mythological figures of Hellenistic Greek architecture in a way that seems deliberately designed to declare that this desert kingdom belonged among the great civilized powers of its age. And the same architectural ambition can also be seen at Hegra, a second major Nabataean city founded further south in what is now Saudi Arabia, where dozens of elaborately carved tomb facades still rise dramatically from the flat desert plain, their inscriptions offering us some of the only surviving words actually written by Nabataeans themselves, brief but formal legal texts nomming the family members' permitted burial rights, invoking the protection of the chief Nabataean god Dashara against grave robbers, and occasionally even crediting the stonemasons who carved them, texts that let us recover fragments of ordinary Nabataean lives, including the names of physicians, priests, governors, diviners, and craftsmen who once walked the streets of these rose-colored cities. And thanks to descriptions left by visitors like the Greek geographer Strabo, we also have a reasonably vivid picture of daily life in Petra at its height, a city where citizens wore brightly dyed clothing, cultivated gardens and fruit orchards using their sophisticated irrigation systems, gathered for great annual festivals involving communal feasting and moderate, tightly regulated drinking, and burned frankincense daily on rooftop altars in devotion to their sun god Dashara, all while living in a society that, remarkably for its era, appears to have relied very little on slave labor, with even the king reportedly serving guests at banquets alongside his own subjects. And this golden age of prosperity and relative independence could not last forever, because a new and far more overwhelming power was steadily expanding across the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, which by the end of the 1st century BC had absorbed Egypt, installed a client king over neighboring Judea, and begun eyeing the immensely profitable incense trade that the Nabataeans had controlled for generations. And Rome's first serious attempt to seize direct control of that trade came in 26 BC, when the Emperor Augustus dispatched a prefect named Aelius Gallus on a major military expedition into Arabia, guided, seemingly cooperatively, by a Nabataean official named Silius, who had in fact been secretly instructed by his own king to sabotage the mission from within, and sabotage it he did, leading the Roman force along impossibly roundabout routes through waterless terrain, past harbors with no safe anchorage, and through territory deliberately chosen to exhaust, sicken, and demoralize the invading army, so that after roughly 6 months of wandering, disease, and mounting casualties, Gallus was finally forced to abandon the campaign entirely, retreating with the survivors of his force having accomplished essentially nothing, a humiliating failure that Rome would not attempt to avenge for another century, distracted as it was by internal civil wars and other more pressing frontiers, buying the Nabataean kingdom a further 100 years of fragile independence. But that independence finally came to an end in 106 AD, when the last Nabataean king, Rabel II, died after a long and stable reign. And the Roman Emperor Trajan, apparently seeing an opportunity too good to pass up regardless of any legitimate heir waiting to inherit the throne, ordered 2 full legions into Nabataean territory, an invasion so lightly resisted that Roman chroniclers barely bothered to describe it in detail, and coins minted to commemorate the annexation pointedly described the territory as having been acquired rather than captured, suggesting that even the Romans themselves recognized this had been less a conquest than a peaceful absorption. And for ordinary Nabataean citizens, life under Roman rule initially changed remarkably little, since Rome largely left the existing water infrastructure untouched, apparently recognizing it as already close to perfect, absorbed the old royal army into its own auxiliary forces, and allowed most local landowners, craftsmen, and administrators to continue their work much as before. while building a major new highway connecting Petra to the Red Sea port of Aqaba and the northern city of Bostra, ensuring that Roman authority and Roman tax collectors could move swiftly through the region. Yet despite these outward signs of continuity, the deeper economic foundations of Petra's prosperity were beginning to erode. First, because Roman administrators increasingly favored the more centrally located and better connected city of Bostra as their regional headquarters, gradually diminishing Petra's political importance. And second, and far more significantly, because the entire ancient incense economy that had made Nabataean fortunes possible was itself changing. As Roman-controlled Egyptian ports increasingly captured incense and spice traffic via sea routes rather than the long overland desert caravans the Nabataeans had once dominated. And later, as Christianity spread across the empire and eventually became its dominant faith, the demand for temple incense collapsed almost entirely, since early Christian worship deliberately avoided the ritual burning of frankincense associated with pagan temple practice. And as demand and prices fell together, the caravan traffic that had once filled Petra's streets slowed to a trickle, leaving the city's grand houses and workshops increasingly empty. And then, just as this long economic decline was already underway, nature delivered a catastrophic blow. Because on the night of the 18th of May in the year 363 AD, a massive earthquake struck the entire eastern Mediterranean region, an event so severe that surviving letters from contemporary bishops describe entire towns collapsing, fires breaking out amid the rubble, and streets running with blood from the sheer scale of casualties. And archaeological excavations in Petra itself confirm the devastation vividly, with entire houses found crushed beneath collapsed roofs. Their contents, lamps, pottery, tools, even a jar of small coins apparently kept for daily household expenses, left scattered and never recovered, a chilling sign that the survivors were too overwhelmed even to salvage their own possessions. And the earthquake proved especially catastrophic for Petra precisely because the city's survival had always depended entirely on its sophisticated water infrastructure that was now shattered, with cracked pipes leaking precious water uselessly into the sand and collapsed dams, allowing the seasonal flash floods that Nabataean engineers had spent centuries tamming to once again rampage unchecked through the city streets. And although some residents did return in the aftermath, clearing rubble and building modest new shelters from salvaged stone, the underlying systems that had once allowed a permanent population of tens of thousands to flourish in this unforgiving desert were never fully restored. And when a second major earthquake struck in the early 5th century, most of what remained of the grand old city was abandoned for good, though a much smaller population did continue living among the ruins for centuries afterward, farming terraced hillsides and dwelling in the carved cave houses that had once served grander purposes. And the city even retained enough significance to be named a provincial capital under the Byzantine Empire, complete with its own bishop recorded as late as the early 7th century, before slipping quietly out of the historical record entirely. And when Arab armies swept through the region in the decades following the rise of Islam, Petra apparently held so little remaining significance that it isn't mentioned even once in the surviving accounts of that great conquest. And in the centuries that followed, later Arab tradition came to associate the eerily carved ruins of Hegra and similar sites with the Quranic story of the Thamud, an ancient people said to have been destroyed by divine punishment for ignoring the warnings of the prophet Salih, a legend that transformed these abandoned monuments into cautionary symbols of pride and impermanence, rather than the remnants of a once thriving and remarkably resourceful trading nation. And this, ultimately, is the strange fate that befell the Nabataeans, a people who rose from nomadic obscurity to command one of the ancient world's most valuable trade networks, who outmaneuvered and occasionally outfought the armies of Hellenistic Greece and imperial Rome not through brute military strength, but through unmatched knowledge of their own harsh homeland, who transformed one of the most punishing environments on Earth into a flourishing garden city through sheer hydraulic ingenuity, and who then, through a combination of shifting trade routes, changing religious practice. And the simple, indifferent violence of tectonic geology faded so thoroughly from memory that their spectacular capital became nothing more than a half-remembered rumor, waiting in silence behind its hidden stone corridor for nearly 14 centuries, until a disguised Swiss traveler, driven by curiosity and a convenient excuse involving a sacrificial goat, finally wandered back down that narrow, shadowed passage and rediscovered, quite by accident, one of the ancient world's most extraordinary lost achievements.